Welcome to another episode of Lessons in Humanities. The title of today's class is Democracy in America. I'm going to be talking about a few issues, for example, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. I'm also going to be talking about the corrupt bargain between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams in 1824. And I'm going to touch a little bit about Jacksonian Democracy, or the Aids of Jackson. So if that's interesting, please watch. Before I begin, make sure you hit the like button and also the subscribe button. That really helps me. I'm a new channel and I'd really like to get some more people watching my videos. Also, if you like this PowerPoint presentation or Google Slides of this presentation, I have it available. There's a link below. I also have some free primary source lesson plans that I think you could really use in your class if you're teaching American history. So let's begin. So this is going to be about the 1800s and the expansion of democracy in America, and it's also going to touch on some of the issues of the divide between the North and the South. Here's a timeline from 1800 to 1848. We're going to be covering in the middle there. If you can see the 1820, the Missouri Compromise. That's going to be very contentious and is going to be one step closer to Civil War, which will happen 41 years later. We're going to end in the 1830s with the Aids of Jackson. So if you need to reference this timeline, it's a good way to visualize a chronological order of when these events happened. Here are the 45 presidents. By the time you watch this, there could be 46. And if you watch this much later, maybe 47 or even more. But nonetheless, the presidents that are going to be mentioned in this presentation will include James Monroe. He will be the president during the Missouri Compromise in 1820. John Quincy Adams, who will be president for 4 years. And then we have Andrew Jackson. So we're going to get into the Jacksonian era. So in the 1800s, the United States was growing and moving west. More immigrants are coming from Ireland and the German states, and people are going to the big cities, but some people are going to the west. There's more roads, there's more railroads, there's steamships, and there's a lot of territory in the west, and some of those territories are going to start to become states. Let's just take a look at this short little video, and it kind of shows you the expansion of the United States from its 13 original colonies to its expansion to the Mississippi River. And then, of course, in 1803 is when Thomas Jefferson, or in his presidency, they purchased the Louisiana Purchase, which will double the size of the United States. And all that territory, it says Louisiana Territory right now, but it's going to say Missouri Territory. Those are going to become states. So a lot of, you see Michigan Territory, Missouri Territory, Arkansas Territory, those are going to become states eventually, and that's going to cause more conflict and lead to a civil war. So there are 22 states in 1819. So it's 11 free states and 11 slave states. Now, the territories, they can become states when they have enough people. They create a state government and a state constitution, and Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, pass a joint resolution, and then they can become a state. And in the 1800s, a lot of the territories to the west and different areas are going to become states. And if you fast forward to the 21st century, there are still territories today, Puerto Rico, Guam, and more, which could become states someday. Who knows? Now, there's a growing divide between the North and the South. It's called sectionalism. This is not the part. I'll have a very special video about sectionalism itself, but it's starting to happen right now, and it's had already been happening, right? The North was growing more commercial and then more industrial during the market revolution, and the South would be more agricultural. Slavery was mostly illegal in the North. It's going to be all illegal by the Civil War, even though there will be some slavery in places like New Jersey because it's a gradual abolition of slavery. Not like an immediate abolition of slavery like what happened in the South after the Civil War with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. But there's a power struggle. There's a struggle between the North and the South, because if there's more free states, the free states or the North will have more power, more representation in Congress, more electoral votes. Same with the South. If there's more slave states, they'll have more power. And also the South has had more power for most of American history up to this point. First 5 presidents, all from the South, because of the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, which said that African slaves represented 3/5 of a person. Now, imagine the South not treating the African slaves as human beings, but using them as population. In some areas like South Carolina, they'd have over 50% of the population were African slaves. In Massachusetts, for example, it would be about 2% were African Americans. So this gave the South a lot more power in the earlier years, but the North was gaining power because more immigration was going to the North, finding jobs in the factories or in the industries. This brings us to the Missouri Compromise. So in 1819, Missouri applied for a statehood, and I just told you what it took to apply for a statehood. You had to have enough people, a state government, and a state constitution. Many settlers who were moving there were bringing their slaves from the South. There was up to 10,000 slaves in the Missouri area, in this area. Not that whole big area that you saw on the map earlier, but in a small section, which is today Missouri. And a lot of Northerners are going there too. So it's a big controversy whether it should be a free or slave state. At this time, 11 states are free, 11 states are slave states. If it becomes a slave state, the South will have more power. If it becomes a free state, the North will have more power. And of course, it's becoming more and more of a moral issue. More and more people are speaking out against the horrors of slavery. So there is going to need to be a compromise. But if you look at this map, look where Missouri is. It's not identified because you see a huge territory, but right near the Mississippi River in the middle there is Missouri, which will become Missouri. And is it going to be slave or free? It's kind of in the middle, right? It's not really north or south. Now, please also notice in the northeast where Maine is today, that is actually Massachusetts. So Massachusetts owns all that territory. So this is before the Missouri Compromise. So what is the compromise? It was supported by Henry Clay, and we know him as a war hawk in the War of 1812, and we'll hear a lot about him in the early to mid 1800s. He'll become known as the Great Compromiser, and one reason is because of the Missouri Compromise. And it should be noted, it wasn't his idea. It was somebody else's idea, a senator from Illinois. But he supported it, and he was powerful and well-known, and he gets to put his name on it. But the idea is that Missouri will be a slave state. And Maine, which was part of Massachusetts, is going to be a free state. So you have that balance between 50-50 free and slave. And then also along the 3630 latitude line, which is the southern border of Missouri, in the future, if there's more states to the west, below that, they can have slavery if they want to. In the north, it would be free states. So this is a temporary solution to a problem that will be ongoing for another 40 plus years. Here's the map after the Missouri Compromise. So you see Missouri there. That is a slave state. And Maine is no longer part of Massachusetts, and now that's a free state. Looking at it from 21st century goggles, it does seem very temporary, and it will be. So the United States is closer to war, civil war. The tensions are rising. This is going to relieve some of that tension, but it won't be for very long. It should also be mentioned at this time there's only one political party. It's the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalists are gone. And they're going to become fractured, split between the North and the South. And there's more and more fear of a civil war. So I have this here. I'm going to have to hide my picture to read this. So read along with me. This is from Thomas Jefferson. This was to a senator in Massachusetts. Now, be mindful, in Massachusetts, slavery is illegal. It's becoming abolished, and in the South, slavery is becoming more and more demand because of cotton. But let's read this and see what does Thomas Jefferson feel about what is happening, and what does he feel about the institution of slavery, keeping in mind that he had over 100 slaves. So it says, "You have been so kind as to send me of the letter to your constituents on the Missouri question." Missouri question is a Missouri Compromise. "I had for a long time ceased to read the newspapers or pay any attention to public affairs, confident they were in good hands." But so he's not listening to what is happening. He has faith in what's happening in the United States, or he did. "But this momentous question, the question of slavery, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the death knell of the Union." He didn't write death, but you can see this has happened in the early 1820s, I think about 1820, 1821, right after the Missouri Compromise. He fears the Union is going to be broken up. This is 41 years before the 41 years before the Civil War. "It is hushed indeed for the moment, so it is stopped. It's a temporary solution. But this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence." Again, he knows this is just temporary. It's just putting a Band-Aid on a big wound. A geographical line, 3630 line, coincided with a marked principle, moral and political. So he's talking about the moral implications of slavery, but also the political, the power implications of what is happening in the United States at this time. "Once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper." So the United States is becoming deeper and deeper and more divided over this question. "I can say with conscious truth that there is not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would." So he would do anything to stop this separation between the North and the South, to relieve us from this heavy reproach. Keep in mind, he owns a lot of slaves. "In any practicable way, the cession of that kind of property." So what property is this? He's talking about slaves, for so it is misnamed. And then he's also admitting that that is a misnomer, which is interesting. "Is a bagatelle," excuse my pronunciation, "a bagatelle is like a small matter, which would not cost me in a second thought." So he's saying he would give up his slaves to save the Union. Now, is he saying that because he wants to save this country that he helped found, or is he saying that because of the moral reasons? "If in that way a general emancipation," so emancipation of the slaves, "and expatriation could be effected." Expatriation. So at that time, when people were speaking of freeing the slaves, it was a question of what to do with the freed slaves. Could they live in society where they had been treated so poorly before? Could white people and black people live peacefully next to each other? A lot of people, even Abraham Lincoln, thought that after the freeing of slaves, they would be sent back to Africa. And gradually, and with due sacrifices, I think it might be. But as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, so slavery by the ear, and we can neither hold him. We can't continue the way we are, nor safely let them go. So we can't let him go. So we can't let slavery end, because there will be chaos and problems in the South. But we can't keep it for moral reasons. I think that's a fair analysis of that. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation is at the other. So justice, the moral or immoral morality of slavery, and the self-preservation, the South, they had come to demand. They needed slavery. They couldn't survive without it. That was a lot of people's feelings at the time. So this is an interesting quote, but it shows you the severity of what was happening in the United States at that time and how it was getting closer to a civil war. All right. So let's move on to another slaveholder, Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory. So this is one of the most controversial presidents in American history. From owning slaves to his acts during war, to his treatment of Native Americans. So he's the son of two Irish immigrants. Only at the age of 13, he joined a militia in the American Revolution, and he hated the British. He lost his mother and two brothers during the Revolution from disease. He was also captured by the British, and they told him to polish his shoes, and he refused, and he got beaten. He was uneducated, but he worked very hard. He became a lawyer. He was self-taught. He taught himself, kind of like Lincoln. He also fought in duels. I said a duel, but it should be duels. And he worked in Congress as a in the House of Reps and Senate. He actually quit the Senate for financial reasons. He would be a general. He was a hero of the Battle of New Orleans and some other wars or small battles or big battles. And he would become the 7th president of the United States. And as I mentioned, he's very controversial because of slavery and because of his treatment of Native Americans. And I think an interesting note is, this will be on my next lesson, but he does the Indian Removal Act, which would force the Native Americans to leave during the next presidency's time, and they have to travel many miles to Oklahoma, and many would die during this time. But it should be noted that he often fought with a lot of Native Americans, and he adopted 2 Native American children. So just an interesting addition to that the complexity of Andrew Jackson. So I mentioned duels. He did fight in some duels. And this one is with Charles Dickinson. This was only 2 years after Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton, so it was obviously more common at that time. But this shows you a little bit about Andrew Jackson's character. Charles Dickinson, he called him a cheater in some horse race, and he also made fun of Rachel Jackson, his wife. So he challenged them to a duel, and he was in maybe a dozen duels. There's so many different estimations of how many duels Andrew Jackson was in, but more than one. And but Charles Dickinson, and this is not the writer, this is somebody else from the time, was known as one of the best shots in Kentucky at the time. So they dueled, and Dickinson turned around and he shot Andrew Jackson right near the heart, inches away from his heart, but he didn't die. He just held his chest and stopped the bleeding, and then he took aim and he shot Charles Dickinson. And some accounts say that he shot the first one and missed, and shot a second one and killed him. And you're not supposed to do that. Etiquette was, for example, Charles Dickinson shot him and he didn't die. He was supposed to just stand there and just take another shot if Andrew Jackson shot it. And if Jackson missed it, that was it. But suppose this is not a fact. This is just one account, is he shot twice. But nonetheless, he had a bullet right near his heart that would be there for the rest of his life. And he said, "Shall I have gotten shot in the brain, I still would have killed him." He said that many years later. But it shows you a little bit about the character of Andrew Jackson. Now, there's many things we could talk about Jackson, and please watch my next lesson because I'm going to go more into detail about his presidency. But he, in addition to being the hero of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, which made the United States feel that they won the war, he also invaded Spanish Florida. So this was during Monroe's presidency. And the Seminoles, who used to be known as the Creeks, but their name changed over time with the Spanish taking over Florida, they were attacking. Well, first of all, they helped the British during the War of 1812, but they were also attacking Americans on the border of Spanish Florida and the United States. And they were also helping African Americans run away and to freedom to these little colonies in Spanish Florida where they could be free. So Andrew Jackson was sent down to Florida to stop this, but his instructions were vague. This was by the Secretary of War during Monroe's presidency. So he went down there, and he went down there a couple of times over a period of 2 years, and he actually invaded Florida, and he took a couple British citizens as hostage who were helping the Seminoles, and this was a diplomatic crisis between the United States and Britain. But this is the thing, is Monroe was very upset about this happening. He's very upset that Andrew Jackson did this, and he wanted him out. But the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, used this opportunity to purchase Florida from the Spanish because there's so many American soldiers already in Spanish Florida, that Spain figured, well, we can make some money, and they're already here, so we will sell it to them. And another interesting note is the relationship between John Quincy Adams, who is the son of the second president, John Adams, and Andrew Jackson was pretty good at this time, but that's not going to last. So we have an election of 1824, and that's what I'm talking about. So there's only one political party at this time, right, which is very rare in American history. So the Federalists are gone after the War of 1812. They slowly disappear. And this is the era of good feelings because the United States had defeated the British. Even though they hadn't, they thought they did. But it's also the era of good feelings because there's only one political party, and that political party is the Democratic Republicans. There are 4 candidates, 3 of them significant: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay. I'm not going to talk about William Crawford, and I'm sure he was significant in his own way, but to this story, he is not. Nobody won the majority of electoral votes, but Jackson had one of the most popular votes. And as you know from the election of 2016, it doesn't matter who wins the popular votes, it's the electoral votes. Well, oddly enough, Jackson also won the plurality of the electoral votes, but he didn't win the majority. There were 4 candidates, and you have to win a majority. So it gets a little confusing, but just realize that there was no clear winner. But Jackson won the popular vote and the plurality, the most electoral votes. But what happens in this case? They go to the House of Representatives to decide, and they do that today if it's necessary. And I'm just showing this electoral map because you see it is quite close. Adams, who is from Boston, he had most of the North. And keep in mind, they're all Democratic Republicans, even though some of them were kind of favoring old Federalist, strong government ideals, but they're in name Democratic Republicans. Jackson is more widely spread throughout all of the United States. Crawford had a little bit in the middle in Georgia, and then Clay had more in the West. So Clay lost, right? So he's just going to drop out. He's a Speaker of the House, which means he's the leader of the House of Representatives. So that's important for this story. But when you're looking at this point, you see Jackson. He has he's more widely spread out through the United States, right? He had the most popular votes, and he had the most electoral votes. So it seems like he should be the winner, right? It seems like an easy win for him. Well, this is why they call it the corrupt bargain. So there's no clear winner, and the House of Representatives decides the winner. Henry Clay, who was the 4th one, didn't have a chance in this one, dropped out of the election, and he's the Speaker of the House. And the House of Representatives is the ones who are going to choose the president. So Clay tells them to vote for John Quincy Adams, or he has influence on the House of Representatives to choose Adams. They had some similar views, kind of more Federalist type of views, like internal improvements and whatnot, infrastructure, roads and whatnot. But the thing is after, so they chose John Quincy Adams when it clearly, I think it's fair to say that it clearly should have been Jackson because he has more popular electoral votes. It was more widespread throughout the United States. But he convinced the House of Representatives to choose John Quincy Adams. And then he made John Quincy Adams as president, immediately made Henry Clay the Secretary of State. And become Secretary of State was not only prestigious, often it was a stepping stone to become the president. So it appeared to be corrupt. And that's what Andrew Jackson called it, the corrupt bargain. And he said it over and over for 4 years. And that became the identity of John Quincy Adams, the corrupt bargain. And I think you see that today in politics. If you say something enough, whether it's true or not or partially true, it becomes a reality to the wider public. It also should be mentioned that Andrew Jackson is very controversial at the time. Some people love him, some people hate him. So, as I mentioned, they're going to spend 4 years, and when I say they, I mean Andrew Jackson's campaign. He's the type of guy that doesn't want to lose. He has that winning, I guess you could say, personality at all costs. And he's going to spend 4 years, he's just going to smear John Quincy Adams. In the election of 1828, this is when we really have one of these election campaigns just become nasty and just terrible and just mudslinging, similar to what you see today. So this was the dirtiest of them all up until that point, certainly. And one of the dirtiest, I would say, in American history, even though there's some others that could compete with it. But Jackson campaign, they accused John Quincy Adams of corruption, obviously, of being an elitist. You know, he's from Boston. He's the son of John Adams, the first president, and of offering the Russian Tsar, Alexander, a prostitute. I don't know if that's true or not, but they accused him of it. Adams' campaign, John Quincy Adams' campaign, was relentless against Andrew Jackson. They called him a murderer. Remember all the duels? You have the Creek Wars. You have the Battle of New Orleans, which was a great victory for the United States, but a lot of Brits died. There was an invasion of Spanish Florida. So he called him a murderer. And if you look at this picture, you see the coffins. So this is kind of an ad or an account. I think this would be an ad or an article about how many people died because of Jackson. They called him a gambler, which is probably true. A brawler, which is probably true to some extent. And marrying a married woman, Rachel Jackson. So you remember, that's why he fought the duel in the first place. See, what happened was she was married. Rachel Jackson was married to a man before Andrew Jackson. The guy was abusive. So they were going to divorce. In fact, she had to get away from this guy because he was so abusive. And this guy was supposed to go officially divorce her, you know, with the paperwork. But he never did. And she didn't know it, supposedly. Maybe she did. I don't know. Maybe she knew that he never officially signed the papers, but the story goes that she didn't know it, right? And the story goes is that technically they were still married, even though they were separated. And she married Andrew Jackson, and this news came out. So she was ridiculed, you know, especially in polite society back then, you know. Any sign of cheating or sleeping around or that type of stuff was not acceptable in the early 1800s. But she was just treated awfully during the election of 1828. And Andrew Jackson is going to be the winner. And she's going to die right before he becomes president. And he will never forget that, the death of Rachel Jackson. But nonetheless, this brings us to the age of Jackson, 1828 into the 1830s. And please watch my next video, which will come out next week. This will go into more detail about this time period. But this is the time of what is known as Jacksonian Democracy, or the age of Jackson, where more white males over 21 could vote. Not African Americans, not Native Americans, not women, but more people could vote. In the beginning, it was more just the elites. The Founding Fathers didn't really trust everybody to vote, right? It's a republic, not a direct democracy. But this is widening the range of people who could vote during Andrew Jackson's presidency. And he was known kind of as a populist, as somebody who supported or represented the common man, because he came from modest means, very poor, and he taught himself how to be a lawyer. He taught himself how to be a general in the war, and he wasn't that educated. I mean, he spelled Congress with a K, at least a couple times, but he worked so hard. He did whatever it could take to rise above. And he was so decisive, and that's the wrong word, divisive. I'll fix that. So if you get this PPT from my store, I'm going to fix that after this video. He split the Democratic Republican Party. So we went from the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans in the early part of the Republic, and the Federalists will fade away. And in this era of good feelings of just one party, the Democratic Republicans, now it's going to be split into the National Republicans. These are the anti-Jackson Party. They're going to be called the Whigs. And then the Democratic Republicans. But the Democratic Republicans are just going to turn into Democrats. So we finally have one of today's political parties, and that's the Democrats. Today's Democratic Party started with Andrew Jackson. And It started in 1828 or around that time when he became president. Now, some people will argue that the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, is the first Democratic Party. So it depends on what historian or what person you talk to. But many people will agree that Andrew Jackson is the first Democrat. Now, you can't compare the Democrats of then to the Democrats of today. Times have changed. But this is, for the purposes of this video, the first Democratic Party. So now we have the Whigs and we have the Democrats. We don't have the Republicans yet. They're coming, so be patient. And Andrew Jackson, and he was so divisive. I mean, that's why you have the Whigs, or the National Republicans, who would become the Whigs, because there's a lot of people that hated this guy, and there's a lot of people that loved this guy. And the people that hated him, well, they started a new party, but also they called him a jackass. And he liked it so much, Jackson, jackass. He liked it so much that, he went with it. And then the Democrats became the donkeys, right? That became their symbol. So that's an interesting little story. But there's no Republicans now, so I can't tell you about the elephants. But that's it. We're moving into the age of Jackson. That'll be the next class. So please join me. And thank you for making it this far. Again, please give me a thumbs up. I really need it. I don't have a big following yet, but I think my material and content is useful. And subscribe. And also please check out my store. I really appreciate it. All right, thank you, and see you next time.